Boffins Books. I'm Barbara Horgan and I'm the Manager of Fiction and Children's Books at Boffins. Tonight we're delighted to host the launch of Dianne's new insightful YA novel, Forgetting Foster, that's been receiving rave reviews. Earlier this year we launched the Boffins YA Club with support from a grant from James Patterson. With over 200 members and over 100 Facebook followers. If you'd like to join, please fill in the form at the counter. We'd be delighted. We're also delighted that some of the Boffins YA Club members are here tonight. Amy Wood, our Boffins YA guru, would love to tell you about the club, so have a chat with her tonight. Amy.
I'm here.
Over there. Thank you to Garth, to Amy, to Claire and to Nick for their help tonight. All the Boffins staff would be happy to help in any way they can. And also a big thank you to Angela Stanner, our Great Allen Nunman WA Accounts Manager, for all her help and support. And also to Tilly. Tilly's here, she's going to do some videoing tonight. I'm so happy to introduce Julia. Reading her bio was amazing. She's packed so much into her life so far. And you look so fantastic.
Get on this side of the eyeballs.
But I've got glasses on. And Julia's written some amazing books, including The Flyaway Girls and Bye Beautiful. Please welcome Julia.
Thank you. Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming out on this very chilly evening to the launch of this incredible and incredibly special novel, Forgetting Foster. I was going to do some acknowledgements, but I think I'm being bookended by those, so I'll just say welcome everybody. I first met Dianne, or should I say properly talked to her at an IBI dinner about 5 years ago. I won't tell some of the naughty things that we were doing, but anyway, I do feel as if I've known her forever, and the only reason I know it's 5 years is because of one of the topics of our conversation that night, which was early onset Alzheimer's disease, cheerful dinner conversation and all that. And we talked about it because my husband was not yet diagnosed, but he was starting to show signs that I suspected and feared were the beginnings of early onset, such as obsessively purchasing sandwich bags, repeatedly flooding the kitchen sink and giving away money to perfect strangers. And Di talked about her grandmother's development into increasingly eccentric behaviour, such as pulling into ice cream containers. So we're kind of, crying and laughing. And neither of us, though, could have imagined that we would be standing here 5 years later launching this novel. And I want us to just pause for a moment to appreciate and celebrate how things have changed for Dianne in the intervening 5 years. 5 years ago, Creepy and Maud was still a manuscript. It hadn't been shortlisted for the CBCA Awards. It hadn't been named one of the New Zealand Listeners' 50 Best Children's Books of 2013, or one of the Australian Book Review's Books of the Year 2013. It hadn't been published in Germany. It hadn't been read, marvelled at, and adored by thousands of readers, teenagers and adults, all over the world, regularly attracting epithets such as original/unique, a revelation, deliciously dark, as well as disturbing and uncomfortable, which are words used as praise rather than as pejoratives. Following Creepy and Maud, which was one of those books that I've given to every literate person I know, was A Small Madness, a manuscript which was in a bottom drawer 5 years ago. Since that time, A Small Madness has been published in Germany, in North America, and will be published soon in the UK. And of course, it was also a notable in this year's CBCA Awards. I'm not sure why it wasn't on the shortlist, but anyway. It too has attracted the kind of breathless reviews and descriptions that its predecessor did. My favourite quote being from Vicky Wakefield, who's no slouch of a writer herself, who said, "Dianne Touchell writes with a skewer, finding tenderness and beauty in moments of madness and horror. Rose and Michael are young, in love, and they've done something unforgivable. Yet we understand and we forgive. An intimate, beautiful, important novel that challenged my beliefs and broke my heart." The breaking of hearts is a theme in all of Di's work. And now we have Forgetting Foster, a novel that will rend your heart in a completely different way to the previous two novels. Foster is 7 years old and his adoring father, the teller of stories, the general to his troops, is changing. He's not just forgetting things, he's forgetting who he is. The horribly typical path of early onset Alzheimer's, a disease that hits as indiscriminately as cancer but has no illuminating hope of cure, is shown here from a child's eyes. We see the personality change, the collapse of personhood, the loss of dignity which is happening to Foster's dad, when he leaves bacon burning on the stove, when he uses his story voice, the voice he uses for all the stories he tells his son, to his clients over the phone, when he cries at the dinner table. He displays behaviour that could be seen as funny, from putting on the wrong socks to saying out loud the things that are normally kept to yourself, to behaviour in which the true loss of dignity is shown, like him pissing himself in church, an act misattributed to poor Foster, who suffers being blamed by his classmates, until he is finally forced to betray his father to save himself. Dianne brilliantly describes Foster's dad as having a hole in his head, one that was becoming bigger and bigger, until even a reminder could no longer nudge the forgotten thing back into place. The effect of his father's illness on Foster is described pithily. Foster was unprepared for how much a change in someone else could wilt the pieces of himself he thought he knew best. Di shows not only the wrenching changes inside the family, but the way that they are misunderstood and unrepresented outside of it. We see the lack of understanding from children and the adults who should know better. We see people who prey on the family's vulnerability, from the meddling, uninvited sister, through the neighbour who is cruel to Foster and his father, but who presents herself as only wanting to help. We see a world in which the services provided by aged care don't fit the family. When Foster looks at pamphlets from the service providers, Foster sees pictures of well-dressed, happy old people doing craft and playing board games. It occurred to Foster that there were no people in the pictures like Dad. Like early onset Alzheimer's itself, a story about Alzheimer's is never going to have a happy ending. But this story is made not only bearable but radiant by Foster himself, who is something I thought I would never say about a Touchell character. He is sweet and appealing, as well as smart and uncompromising. His innocent negotiation of his father's illness is rendered in Dianne's impeccable prose. Foster's father taught him well. Rituals help make sense of the unfathomable. It is the loss of rituals that mean most to Foster which provide the emotional knot at the heart of this novel. Foster hadn't climbed the jacaranda in a long time. He began to feel the familiar flurry of tickly papery wings in his chest that always made him want to climb. But it was dark outside. There was a moon tonight. It had risen into the top left corner of the kitchen window and glazed everything nicely. Foster liked the moon. He liked its unpredictable changing from nothing to fullness. He liked the way its light was put out every month and then came back. He knew that it was called wax and wane. Dad had told him that. Dad had even sung him a song about it. Foster tried to remember the words to the song now, but the only thing he could keep in his head was a song about a bullfrog called Jeremiah, so he sang that instead. The ritual that does endure through the loss and the confusion, from symptoms of early onset to its diagnosis, is the ritual of telling stories. At the beginning of Forgetting Foster, we have the father wielding the power of narrative in Foster's classroom. On story day at school, when mums and dads were invited to come to class to read aloud, it was always his dad who came, even though he had a suit job. Hardly any dads came. It was mostly mums in jeans, but his dad would come from work in the middle of the day, carrying a briefcase with a lock that popped like a dodgy knuckle, and inside would be Foster's favourite books from home. Sometimes his dad would just make up a story on the spot, and even with no pictures, everyone was still and quiet, his dad's voice dusting the room like bow resin, rising and falling to the rhythm of battle cries, dragons and triumphant heroes. He would walk the room while he spoke, using his hands and eyes as punctuation, circumnavigating the clusters of desks, boys' faces following like awe-struck marionettes. Dad would always kiss him goodbye afterwards. Foster wasn't embarrassed. This excerpt also shows Dianne's remarkable facility with the perfect simile, embedded in the prosaic, making the language both literary and accessible, and showing that those qualities are not mutually exclusive. The father has given the gift of storytelling to his son, and Forgetting Foster closes with the son returning the gift to his father. It is a redemption of sorts for the bystanders of a disease for which no redemption is possible. I don't know how Dianne wrote this book without breaking into a million pieces. My husband is now at the end of what is called the Alzheimer's journey, and my daughter, who was a child at the beginning of it, is now nearly an adult. So I appreciate more than most people not only the timeliness of this book, but its importance. There has been an inexplicable rise in early onset Alzheimer's disease in Australia. More than 25,000 people under the age of 65 have been diagnosed with it, and there are concerns that many others are misdiagnosed with stress and depression or alcoholism or other types of mental illness. There are about 5,000 people in aged care facilities, and I am lucky that my husband is in the only early onset facility in Western Australia, because his brief stint in other places showed that aged care facilities, like services designed for the aged, are often not equipped to deal with younger people with Alzheimer's. This increasing incidence of early onset, combined with later average ages of parenthood, means that Foster's story is going to become more common, which makes this beautiful book even more vital. It will change the way we think about the children of parents with early onset. It will begin a conversation we have not yet had in this country. But you don't have to buy this book for political reasons. Buy it because, quite simply, it is Dianne Touchell's best novel yet. And it is my pleasure and privilege to declare Forgetting Foster officially launched.
I just want to speak fairly briefly first about the grief of losing someone before you lose them. It doesn't matter what age you are when you lose a parent. You might as well be 7. The feelings are exactly the same. We're wired that way. And I think C.S. Lewis said it best when he wrote, "No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I am not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. I keep on swallowing. At other times it feels like being mildly drunk or concussed. There is a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It's all so uninteresting, yet I want the others to be about me. I dread the moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me." That is from his book, A Grief Observed. And I think the clue is in the title, because you do observe grief. Quite astonishingly, even when you're in the crux of it, you observe yourself, you observe others, you observe time passing, observe time not passing. Shouldn't have looked at my sister. And you think that you will never be a part of the real world again. Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia mean some of us lose people before we lose them. For some of us, grief is a dog that sinks its teeth in while the heart is still beating and the hands are still warm. Sorry, can you excuse me for just a second? Oh, is everyone having a good time? Oh, good grief. Oh, sorry, just give me a second. It's, grief, hormones. Okay. I felt the first proper bite of that grief the moment my mother looked at me with fear in her eyes instead of recognition, the moment she didn't trust me anymore, the moment seeing my face made her angry instead of happy. I might as well have been 7. So I wrote this book from the point of view of a 7-year-old. One of the excruciating things about caring for someone who is no longer completely themselves is that it is so isolating, even if you're surrounded by family and other carers. So often you find yourself talking in logistical terms, analysing practicalities, creating rosters and schedules, interpreting medical jargon and hoping to God nobody asks, "How are you?" because it'll be the thing that tips you over the edge. If you take away all of those things, the management, the procedures, all of the things that make up the scaffold that a carer grips onto to stop themselves falling apart, you end up with a half-size human looking up, staring up at others, wondering what the hell is going on. You end up with a 7-year-old. But the other indomitable thing about children and their perspective is their hope, their vulnerability, their adaptability. We grown-ups tend to overlook this in children because we need to control so much. The beautiful thing about children is they haven't learned to white-knuckle anything yet. This is why their responses can be so frustrating and so hopeful. A 7-year-old hasn't lost their trust in the world yet, which is another reason I wanted to write this story from the perspective of a small child. And I regret so much that my mother never got to read this one, because I think she really would have liked it. Now there are some people I'd like to thank. Erica Wagner, my publisher at Allen & Unwin, who gave me more time as I missed deadline after deadline because I was in the real life middle of what I was writing about. Her care and advice have always steered me right, and I feel very, very grateful to have a home at Allen & Unwin. Sophie Splatt, my editor, who seems to know exactly when to rein me in and exactly when to leave me the hell alone, and she manages to keep her sense of humour. Robert Schofield, whose notes on the first draft made this a better book. I have to thank the day job. Kevin and Lavana Kroon and Jackie Kroon Hargrave. Jackie, where are you? Right at the back. Who was so supportive of this other crazy job that I have, and who give me time off to spruik myself at conferences, and who have become really good friends as well as employers. Jackie, I need Thursday, March 23rd, 2017 off. I have a thing. My father, Bill Touchell, to whom this book is dedicated, I learned 3 important things from him in my life. Now, he probably wouldn't phrase them the way I'm going to, but they are: 1, don't pay attention to shit that has nothing to do with you. 2, always be kind first and kick ass later if you have to. And 3, don't get into debt. Quite random. Barbara, Amy, and the team here at Boffins, thank you so much for hosting this launch, your beautiful hospitality, and all the work you did to put this together.
Our pleasure.
And Julia, I was going to talk about the Ibby dinner.
With bits.
I met Julia at the Ibby dinner when I was a bookseller a long, long time before I had published anything, but I was an avid reader of her work. We found ourselves sitting next to each other at that table, and there was hand-holding and tears and a sneaky fag in the laidway. And one of us drank too much. I'm not sure. But Julia is the only person that I wanted to launch this because she gets it. And I thank you for your friendship and your advice and your love and all of those things. Now, someone suggested that I should do a reading.
Yes, reading.
But I didn't bring a copy of my own book. Chapter called Spontaneous Bacon Combustion. Foster smelled at first. A bitter, hot smell like microwave popcorn popped too long. Except Dad wasn't making popcorn. Dad was making bacon sandwiches. Foster walked into the kitchen. He could see blue flames licking the sides of the pan, the shiny white enamel blackening, long sooty fingers crawling towards the lip. A soupy gloom of darkening smoke rolled up and up until it hit the range hood like a solid mass and spilled into the space above Foster's head. It formed clouds he could taste. Dad? Dad wasn't in the kitchen. You weren't supposed to leave pans on the stove unattended. That's what Mum always said. Dad! Foster wasn't allowed to touch the stove. He knew how to turn it off, but he didn't want to get told off. He took a couple of steps forward, arced himself up onto tippy toes, and was suddenly and shockingly backhanded by the whooshing heat of the oil in the pan catching fire. Foster ran from the room as the smoke morphed into a pillar of bright orange. Dad! Foster ran down the hall, instinctively slapping doors ajar until he got to the last room on the left. Dad was standing at the side of his and Mum's bed sorting socks from the clean laundry pile. He wasn't doing a very good job. Dad! Bacon! Foster pulled at his dad's arm, the smell of smoke indistinguishable from the stinging choke of his own panic. It was the smoke alarm that yanked Dad out of his sock coma. He ran to the kitchen, Foster immediately behind him. Foster pressed himself against the pantry door, the relentless squawk of the smoke alarm pulling his breath tighter and faster. Dad clamped the lid on the pan and threw it in the sink. He grabbed a tea towel and started flapping it about wildly, throwing open the kitchen window with such force it skidded out of the track and cracked as it landed against the frame. Foster slid down the pantry door onto the kitchen floor and squished his ears with his fists. The smoke alarm kept going and going, Dad finally silencing it by harpooning it with a broom handle. Then Dad slid down onto the floor next to Foster. The wall was black. There were some little blisters in the paint and mucky grease skid marks down the front of the stove and cupboards. The smoke alarm dangled from the ceiling. Splinters of plastic littered around the discarded broom like flower petals. Foster held Dad's hand, and their breathing gradually slowed together. Mum's going to be mad, Foster said. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. That's me.
Just on behalf of Boffins, we'd like to thank you both for sharing your stories. It's absolutely beautiful. I've read the book myself and loved it, so we're hoping that you'll be able to sign some books now. So if you'd like to take your copies over to the table where Dianne will be, and we'll have some autographs.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you.
Smile at me while you're doing it.
Thank you.